Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Learning how to weave but need the right shuttle? Hooked on knitting and in search of a lofty yarn? Yarn Barn of Kansas has been your partner in fiber since 1971. Whether you are around the corner from the Yarn Barn of Kansas or around the country, they are truly your local yarn store with an experienced staff to answer all your fiber questions. Visit yarnbarn-ks.com to shop, learn, and explore. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Anita Osterhaug is a weaver and author. She served as editor of Handwoven magazine from 2011 to 2016. So Anita, thanks for joining me.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So, Anita, you and I have worked together for years, but the thing that really made me think I have to get you on the podcast is that a copy of your book just crossed my desk. Can you tell me a little bit about your wonderful book?
Well, sure. The book is called Nordic Hands, and it came out at the end of last year. It is both a book of projects that are Nordic textiles or inspired by Nordic textiles. And it is a book about Nordic culture. Actually, it came about, as so many things do, because of Linda Ligon, who was the founder of Interweave and of Long Thread. And Linda called me up one day and said, I've decided you're going to write a book about Nordic textiles. And I said, oh, really? She said, yes, I've decided this. And I said, well, I've had a book in mind about Nordic textiles, and it was going to be a book about weaving techniques, traditional Norwegian, but not just Norwegian weaving techniques. And she said, and that's great. And you can write that for your second book. But this first book is going to have both knitting and weaving. And I said, I hadn't thought about that. So anyway, I started thinking about, well, there are a lot of, as we all know, there are a lot of Nordic knitting books. There are books about mittens and books about sweaters and you name it. And so I thought, why should this book be different? And I thought, well, what motivates me about Scandinavian textiles and Scandinavian culture? Because I've been studying Scandinavian textiles for many, many, many years, going to Nordic textile conferences, weaving conferences, knitting conferences. And I had been, actually, my first visit to Scandinavia was in 1996 with Interweave. And I thought, well, it's the history of my family. It's the culture of my family. I fell in love as a child with the textiles that my grandmother had brought from Norway. And I just, to me, they say family, they say home. And I decided, and what is it about that culture that I love? And a lot of it is the values that I grew up with. So the book is organized around 4 values of Nordic culture. And those are community, sustainability, craftsmanship, and a love of nature. And the projects are organized around those 4 values. And it's not just because, I can't just write introductions to projects. I have to have research, and I have to tell stories, because it's what I love about textiles are the stories. When I was editor of Handwoven, every now and then I would sort of challenge our readers, why does it matter that you weave a towel? There are perfectly good towels you can buy at the store. They're beautifully woven, often overseas. They're good quality. They're not expensive. So why do you weave a towel? Why does it matter? And the answer is it matters, right? Because it's you, because you made it, because it's the process and the thought that goes into it. And the person you give it to knows that it's handmade, and you're continuing a tradition. So I wanted the book to be about those traditions and those values. And it is. And I had a wonderful time writing it. And the only hard thing was that it was COVID. And I had at the outset thought, I can go to Scandinavia and, meet with people and take pictures. And I couldn't. So I called my friend Lauren Gilbertson, who is the curator at Vesterheim. And because I know from leading tours myself that there are always a couple of people who are wonderful photographers. So I called her and asked, who on your tours to Scandinavia is a fabulous photographer? And can you put me in touch with them? And she put me in touch with John and Vera Capone, who are Vesterheim members, and Vera's a former board member. And their photographs, it turned out, were stunning, absolutely stunning. And both of textiles and of places and people. And I explained what I was doing, and they said, we'll send you all of our photographs, use what you want. And one of the reviews that the book gets is that it is gorgeous. And it is gorgeous due to John and Vera Capone. Their photographs are just gorgeous. Just, I could never have done what they did.
Well, they're beautiful places too.
Yeah. So that's the book in a nutshell. And because I am, and originally the publisher said, can you have it for us in 6 months? And of course, that's crazy. And I panicked. But I thought, how can I can't design 25 projects in a year and write a book. But I know lots of people from my interweave days and from just having studied, I know lots of people who are keeping these traditions alive today. And I thought, what better way to make a book than to honor all those people and include them? So I designed 6 projects in the book, and my friends designed other projects. So a very good friend since childhood, Sarah Shippen, designed a lot of knitting projects, and another friend who's an excellent knitter, Deb Beck. And John Malarkey, who is an amazing band weaver, and Jan Mostrom and Lisa Hill. So it exemplifies the value of community, because it definitely took a village to make this book. It was a wonderful experience.
When I think about Scandinavian textiles, I just think about how lovely they are and how it's such a cold place. You would have to have a really high level of skill of textiles.
There's
so even without sort of that deeper understanding of the Scandinavian culture, the Scandinavian weaving, Swedish, Norwegian weaving have such richness and interest, and there are so many structures and traditions there.
There are. And as you say, it was a matter of survival. But I think in most kinds of folk art, there's survival, but people in traditional societies also have time. There are the winters, and they take the time to make things beautiful. And these things also have a lot of cultural significance. So, for example, there is a kind of weaving called in Norway, it's called skilbragd, which means, I think, beautiful work. And skilbragd is with the kinds of very simple looms that people had. It takes a lot of skill to make it. There's a lot of hand work to the patterning. You don't just treadle and throw your shuttle. And skilbragd, because it was so hard to make, was something very special. So a skilbragd blanket was given as a christening present. It was given as a wedding present. And in fact, at christenings, there would be a Sunday in the spring when they would do a lot of christenings at church. And everyone was looking around to see who had the best skilbragd blanket, because That was a status symbol. And there are Schilbrag blankets that are woven with a cross pattern in the middle. Basically, the pattern is ongoing, but there is a cross of a different color where a different color is inserted. And that in traditional culture symbolizes a crossroads. And this kind of Schilbrag was draped over a coffin and a candle, and the cross symbolized the crossroads of death, of a change in life. And a candle was put at the center of that to give a light to the transition. They have a lot of meaning. And that is one of the things that really has always attracted me to them.
And now a word from our sponsors. Sustainability and regenerative ranching have been a way of life for the ranches of Shaniko Wool Company for decades. They're the first farm group in the U.S. to achieve certification to the rigorous International Responsible Wool Standard and Nativa Regenerative. Shaniko ranches raise merino Rambouillet sheep in the western U.S., delivering a fully traceable wool supply that gives back to the earth and its ecosystems. To learn more and discover Shaniko's yarn partners, visit ShanikoWoolCompany.com. Knitters know Manos del Uruguay for their yarn's rich tonal colors, but the story of women's empowerment and community benefit enriches every skein. Discover 17 bases from lace-weight to super bulky, made and dyed at artisan-owned cooperatives in Uruguay. Ask for Manos at your local retailer or visit FairmontFibers.com. And now back to the show. And at least in the U.S., there is a really strong tradition of affinity for one's Scandinavian roots. So, my mother has gotten really into her Swedish heritage, but we had Laura Ann Gilbertson as a guest podcast quite a while ago. And the Vesterheim is this gorgeous museum that has a lot of textiles. Of course, I'm interested in the textiles, but has a lot of items preserved because people care so much about their Scandinavian heritage.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And my grandmother took great pride in the things she brought with her from Norway, and they were prominently displayed. And Vesterheim is just the book really couldn't exist without Vesterheim because of what I've learned there, because of the time I've been able to spend in the collection. It's just a tremendous resource. When I first learned to weave, I decided to learn to weave because of the Interweaves trip to Scandinavia. I was seeing these beautiful woven things, and they were things like my grandmother had. And I had never really thought about how are they made or where did they come from? And all of a sudden I was seeing them in museums and, everywhere. And I thought, I really want to learn to make that. And I remember this Rose Path coverlet. And I loved the name Rose Path. I kept thinking of a path of roses. And I thought, oh, isn't that marvelous? And so I came home and I learned to weave. And then I thought, great. So where am I going to learn to weave Rose Path? Where am I going to learn to weave those things? And I thought, I had no idea. And so I got online and I Googled Norwegian weaving and what should pop up at the folk art school at Vesterheim. And they keep these traditions alive. And I have been there many, many times taking classes from various teachers. And they do the same with rosemaling, which the flower painting, the traditional flower painting, which I love, but I need another hobby like a hole in the head. And wood carving and just all the traditional crafts. So they're a tremendous resource. And the American Swedish Institute, I did not know at the time, but the American Swedish Institute also does a lot of teaching and hosts classes. So, Scandinavian Americans are very lucky to have these resources. Well, Scandinavian Americans and anybody interested in these techniques and would-be Scandinavian Americans, because I know a few of those. The first time I went to Vesterheim, Sarah Shippen went with me to take a weaving class. And afterwards, she said, I've decided that I'm an honorary Scandinavian. I've decided. So it's like, yes, you are, Sarah, you are. So
I have behind me a rug, a Swedish rug. The colors are not lovely. I think it's some version of kind of a rep weave, but it has come to me in my family, from my Scandinavian side. And the story is that from what I understand, and I should really fact check this, but when people came to the US on ships, in many cases, it was considered a round trip because if you had to go back, it would, like if they didn't take you, you had to be able to go back. So we don't think about it necessarily, but there were people who went back. And she wasn't an ancestor. She would have been a cousin many times removed, but she came over and she was coming over to meet some man whom she was expected to marry. And there was some suggestion that perhaps she was not planning to continue from New York out to Minnesota or the area on the prairie, that perhaps she had been planning to stay in New York, but he came to meet her ship. And so she went to the Midwest and they did eventually go back some years later. They, went back to the old country. Mm-hmm.
Some people did. Well, there's a story that's told in my family. Apparently, America did not want indigents. And so in order to be allowed at Ellis Island, you had to show that you had $25, which at the time was considered enough that you would not, be on the street. My grandmother came with her brothers. People were starving in Norway and they had $25 between them. So the first one through showed the $25 and then passed it back to the person behind. And I'm sure the people at Ellis Island knew this was going on and just chose to look the other way. But they had $25 between them. This is so you could get sent back at Ellis Island if they didn't decide to take you.
It's kind of dark.
It is.
And a lot of these folks were also farmers. And, I tend to think of being a knitter. I tend to think of wool and shepherding as the primary farming. But a lot of the beautiful Scandinavian textiles are also linen. So there's a rich tradition of folks farming. And in this country, a lot of the linen was raised in the Midwest as well. But certainly back in Scandinavia, there were people who were farming flax.
Yeah, which is a tough crop. I mean, with all the work of, preparing it and harvesting it and retting it to get the fibers out. So yeah, that was going on too. And interesting in that there is so little arable land, more in Sweden, a lot more in Sweden. So I kind of wonder whether, and I think you find more linen, in the older textiles, I think you find more linen in Sweden. Sweden had actually a very, in I think the 17th century, had a very well-known commercial weaving industry with linen and stuff by appointment to the queen.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I think Sweden still has a queen.
Still does.
So speaking of linen, that actually reminds me of another way that I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with your work as the editor of Handwoven, but there is something that you have been doing behind the scenes for more than a decade, which is direct and produce craft videos. And what made me think of that is that you had this sort of epic work on producing weaving linen video with Tom Knisley, who's someone that you've collaborated with quite a bit. Can you tell me a little bit about, what people might find surprising about being a video producer?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I can tell you several things. One is that Cecil B. DeMille lights, camera, action. That is not how it works. There are not, at least when we do craft videos, we don't sit in a director's chair with minions running around. It is months of preparation and planning, and that it is intense days of shooting. And what is the saying? Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of panic or something like there's a quote about that somewhere. I forget who said it, but it is and we shoot these videos on location. So we always have to deal with the unexpected. So I spend a long time ahead of time working with the instructor, and they're not scripted. They're not word for word scripted. The only person who word for word scripted himself once was John Malarkey, because that's John.
That's John.
That's John. He was amazing. But, we work out what we want to cover in the outline and what makes sense. And then we get on site and we take it. And sometimes we decide to rearrange. Sometimes we get into it and go, you know what? This really makes sense over there. And we do it in post-production. We do wonders in post-production. But you can have people walk through the room. You can have dogs bark or cats meow. You can have all kinds of things happen. And during the linen video that you're talking about, it was the most amazing week. I got to Pennsylvania. I got to York, where Redstone Glen is. And the videographer was coming in from North Carolina. He'd flown into Baltimore. He was driving up. He called me and said, I'm in the hospital.
Ooh.
Yes. So he's okay. He's fine now.
He's okay.
Yeah. But he was in the hospital. So I had to get another videographer. Fortunately, I have a brother-in-law who's a videographer to fly out on zero notice. And doing the videos, we were outdoors sketching the video or sketching the linen. It was, I think, August in that part of Pennsylvania, which is hot and humid. And there were mosquitoes. And we kept and the light kept changing. So we kept having to reset the camera to get the light right. Poor Tom Nicely, the instructor, was dying in the heat. And I had never realized before that Redstone Glen is in the flight path for Harrisburg Airport. So we had planes flying over every few minutes. So it was just crazy. But, I thought the videos came out very well.
You would never know.
No, I mean, this is the magic of video, is that you can point the camera and have it see what it wants to see. But it's really, really fun. And I think I like the intense concentration of being on set. You're watching. You can't think about anything else. You have to be completely tuned into what's happening. I think a lot of people may not know, when they shoot TV or movies, they're often shooting people from different angles. And so they go through the same scene many times, and they'll be using, usually one camera. When we shoot an instructional video, we're using 3 cameras. So when we're going back and forth between the far away and close up or closer, and then really looking at someone's hands, we're using 3 cameras so that everything is happening at the same time, so that we don't have to worry about continuity. It's like if we shot the same thing twice, somebody's hands might jump from one place to another, and we can't have that. So there's a lot of setup and a lot of concentration. And with weaving, actually, sometimes we have a 4th camera under the loom looking at people's feet. So it's, we call that treadle cam. That's treadle cam. So
treadle cam.
Yeah, I have a
but
special
you get to do something that not a lot of people do, which is visit other weavers in their studios.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And it's like, there's a real, I don't want to say guilty pleasure, but you get to snoop a little. And it's really, really fun. And it's just so amazing to see. I mean, my studio has changed so much over the years because I see something and I think, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to do that. So, and it's just, I don't know, weavers especially tend to set up such serene spaces. And so it's just, I could spend the first day just going and touching things. And then we get to have we go to interesting places and get to have kind of amazing experiences. Like when we shot with Janet Simpson in Michigan, we shot deflected double weave videos with her. Well, she lives on property that's been in her family for many, many years. And they have a private lake and they have these beautiful woods and this house that's like a cabin. And so when we would get done, we would go out on the lake and Jenny and I would go kayaking and Jeff, the videographer, went bass fishing with her husband. So, and then her husband would make crantinis on the porch. No, that was definitely one of the most fun shoots ever. So it's not always like that. And often it's very long days to get everything you need. But yeah, we get to visit interesting places and just getting to know these people. And, when I started making weaving videos, and I've done some spinning videos and at least one or two knitting videos too. But when I started with the weaving videos, and I think I was the first person to shoot any for Interweave, after I learned to weave, I had a full-time job. I had two small kids. I couldn't just go to workshops and conferences all year to learn new. And I knew that there were a lot of other people like me who were not retired, not travel and learn everything they wanted to learn. And so my goal as an editorial director with the weaving videos was to eventually make a set of videos where people like me could, in the comfort of their homes and, if they had kids, after their kids were in bed, watch these videos and learn a full range of weaving skills. And I think we haven't done everything there is to do because weaving is practically infinite in my opinion. But I think really Interweave and then Long Thread continuing that have really achieved that these skills are in weaving and knitting and spinning and dyeing, they're available. And you don't have to be able to travel. I mean, during COVID, the fact that they were there, I had so many friends saying, oh, I had nothing to do. And I watched that video and we're learning new things and moving forward, even though they were stuck at home. And what a gift. So.
Well, and the characters that you work with, and I think to some extent, people are sometimes afraid to really fully be themselves, or they're nervous and they need to kind of relax into it. But
yeah,
the way that getting into someone's studio lets you kind of experience them as a person in a way that the viewer wouldn't otherwise, especially, with the chemistry that you have with them. So.
Yeah, it's very enjoyable and often people are nervous. I mean, the only person that I can remember who wasn't nervous was Tom Nicely. When I shot the first video with him, he he just sat down and, we called him One Take Thomas. And he just sat down and just right through like he'd been doing it his whole life. And at lunch the first day, Jeff and I said, Tom, this is amazing. How are you doing this? He said, oh, I watch a lot of cooking shows on PBS.
Oh.
And that was it. I mean, he had it. He had it down. So, I never thought about always telling the instructor to just watch some cooking shows. And Tom is unique. But
he's one of the things that people notice on a cooking show is that you make the thing and you put it in the oven and then you pull out another one. So, there you have things at various stages. And that's something that we often do in craft videos, but it's harder to do in weaving.
It is harder to do in weaving.
Just pull on another loom.
Right. Well, right. And now if you're shooting at Madeline Vanderhoot's studio, you can do that because Madeline has like 20 looms. But yeah, if you're we used to shoot at the Mannings, if you're weaving on a giant toika, there's only one of those. So yeah, it's tough to do. And sometimes you can do it. And sometimes you just like the weaver is weaving that night and they show the beginning of something and then they're just weaving like crazy that night and we're bringing in food for them. And so that they're ready to do the finishing in the morning. And sometimes, for example, at Redstone Glen, there is a very dedicated weaving community and actually volunteers will come in and weave something off once in a while. But yeah, I think those are called step outs. And step outs it's not a casserole.
Yeah. Especially not in weaving, because the other thing is that even if you have 20 looms, you would have to warp 20 looms.
Yes. Well, yes. And I mean, if you have a large weaving studio and you have help, a lot of these instructors do have help though. Like Jenny Simpson she has students who live in the area and they came and warped looms for the video for her.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes a village.
Yeah, such a community.
Yeah.
Speaking of spinning videos, one of the spinning videos I know you produced was Nilda Cayanyapa Alvarez, who's also been our guest, who's the founder of the Center for Traditional Textiles of Cusco. And you produced her video on Andean spinning.
I did. That was really fun. Yeah, that was an honor. I mean, it's always an honor to work with Nilda and to be a small part of helping carry on these Andean traditions. And I'm a member of the Board of Andean Textile Arts, which is a U.S. nonprofit. And we support weavers in the Andes in revitalizing and preserving their traditions. And I have actually had the great honor of leading tours to the Andes to introduce people to those traditions in Peru. And I'm actually leading a tour to Bolivia next spring. So
that's interesting. So it's very different, but also very similar to your connection with Scandinavian textiles. These are both very textile rich cultures.
They are. And the textile production is very intensive. There are even some of the tapestry techniques and stuff are in common. Well, because, how do you make tapestry? You interlace things. So, but to me, I love folk art. I love folk art and textiles in particular, but to a certain extent, folk art is folk art. In college, my thesis was on peasant revolutions. But my field of study was agrarian societies. And when you're looking at folk art, generally you're looking at agrarian societies. And actually, a friend who's a cultural anthropologist told me we don't use the word peasants anymore because we say agrarian people, and because it has connotations to Westerners. But when I've taught spinning or weaving or knitting, I always tell people things are the way they are for a reason. So, for example, I had someone tell me once, well, I can spin alpaca on an aka spindle. Well, an aka is from Southeast Asia and it's for spinning cotton. And yeah, you can. But why? Why would you? It's not a tool for that job. I had somebody tell me once, well, I could spin with potatoes stuck on a stick. And yeah, you could, but you don't find that in ancient graves. You find beautiful spindle whorls because it's hard to spin with a potato on a stick.
To be fair, the potato would not have lasted in the grave.
Well,
yes.
There's that. In the Andes, it would. It would have dried out.
Oh, that's true.
But I think indigenous cultures, traditional cultures, have a lot of knowledge that's very, very valuable because it's been developed over thousands of years. I mean, when you visit Peru and you go to Cusco, you go to the Coricancha, which was the old Incan temple complex, and there's a Spanish cathedral built on top of it. Over the centuries, in earthquakes, that Spanish cathedral has fallen down, and those Inca stones have not moved, not a millimeter, because of the skill they had in stonework. It's just, I think we should appreciate and learn from what traditional cultures know. And part of what they know is these beautiful textile techniques and just the richness and the complexity. Annie Albers, the famous weaver from the Bauhaus, said that we lost so much when we went to mechanized looms. And when you see what people all over the world weave with backstrap looms, with a couple of sticks, the complexity and the beauty and the patterning, I'm inclined to agree with Annie Albers. So anything I can do to make sure that those things aren't lost, I try to do. And whether it's buying fair trade and supporting people producing those things or going to visit them.
Do you find that it's different working with Andean textile arts and touring these areas than it is kind of relating to the places that you have had a family connection with? I mean, you weren't raised with any Quechua
No.
in your household.
Surprisingly, it's the weaving that unites us. This last spring, I was on a tour to Bolivia, and Jennifer Moore was there, who's a well-known double weaver, and Mary Zicafus, who's well-known for her ikat. And I don't speak Quechua or Aymara. My Spanish is getting pretty good now, but when you sit down with a weaver, and either in Spanish or if there's always somebody on our tours who speaks Quechua and can translate for us. When you start asking questions and talking weaving, it's all of a sudden, you're just weavers together. It's like you're totally relating to each other. And I think people are shy when you go to these small communities because you're from outside. And so they're shy. But when you start asking about the weaving, what they do, all of a sudden they're the expert and and teaching is part of the culture. So they're teaching you. And it's just like all barriers fall away. So it's really pretty wonderful. Well, and the other thing, and I mentioned this in the book, is some people think that Scandinavians are kind of cold. They're not cold, but so like going to where I have family, of course, my family is heaps of fun, but people are more reserved in Scandinavia. They don't assume that you want to hear from them. They just don't always put themselves forward. So actually, I find people in Latin America are very fun-loving and in some ways more outgoing than Scandinavians.
The kinds of challenges that we face in trying to preserve the folk art traditions and specifically textile traditions in Scandinavia and the Andes are quite different at this point, don't you think?
Yes, they really are. And this is actually one of the things that the economy is changing. Tourism is changing things. For people practicing the traditional things, for every person practicing traditional textiles techniques in the Andes, there are 10 people selling knockoffs from China. And tourists don't necessarily know the difference. They just know that, well, that's less expensive. Well, yeah, because this took 4 months. And that came from a factory in China. One of the things that we at Andean Textile Arts try to do is educate people. With our programs, we give free online talks several times a year. We give with our newsletter, with articles, with our blog, and through our tours if people can't make a living raising their animals and doing their weaving, then they're going to go do something else. They're going to go, and some of them we talk to lots of young people who, through their weaving, are earning enough money to go to college. And they're going to be not only, teachers, and a lot of them do go into the tourism industry because that's big, but they're going to be advocates for their communities. They're going to be leaders. They're going to be people who have the leadership and the skills to help defend their communities when the government wants to come take their land for something else, for mining or whatever. So that's great. But there will be other people who won't be able to do that, and they'll go off and they'll get a low-paying job in a restaurant in Lima or something. And, when a culture is lost, it's lost. So it's really important to try to give people choices. And also, when we bring people to visit these communities, for a long time, since the Spanish came, they have been really at the bottom of society. In Bolivia, I just learned Indigenous people weren't fully free until after I was born. They were no longer enslaved. They were servants with obligations, was the legal term. So when we bring people to see them they have had generations of being looked down on. And when people come to learn from them, the pride, it's just palpable that, well, these people came all this way to see us, to learn what we do, and the respect. And just over the years that I've been going to Peru, I have seen it make such a huge difference in just the way they carry themselves when other people are there, the way the confidence, the pride, it's huge.
I remember in 2020 or 2021, one of the things that ATA was trying to do was buy potatoes, literally buy potatoes in Peru.
Yeah, no, it's, normally we don't, social welfare is not, we support education programs there and economic development. But when COVID hit, people were basically, the government told them to stay in their villages. They were isolated. They couldn't sell their weaving. There were no tourists. They had no income. And we kind of very quickly had a meeting and said, what are we going to do? We can't bring people to meet them. We can't help with the textiles sales that way. And so that was when we started having online programs and having special benefit programs. And we just decided if people don't eat, they can't weave. So yeah, we raised money to buy seeds. And it was quite amazing when we were able to go back in 2022 with just the board went back, just had a trip just to visit and see how things were before we brought other people back, because we wanted to make sure we could safely bring tourists. And community after community said, and I'm going to choke up, but they said, when everyone else forgot us, you remembered. So that is something that our community, and it's not the board, it's the ATA community, but I think it's something we can feel very proud of, that we got these people through. And we're talking 650 people. We're talking a lot of families. And we now see those kids going on to a bright future. And we did things like phone cards. People donated phone cards so that the kids could attend school remotely. So it was big.
And 650 people seems like a lot in some ways, but in terms of being able to preserve to hold the repository of knowledge of the skill of Andean weavers, that's not a lot of people. Certainly that's not all of the Andean weavers that exist, but still, that's not a lot of people considering.
No, and when you consider that each small village has its specialties, if you lose the tiny village of Sayak, you lose tapestry and you lose. So it's just any little community that goes away, that's gone. It's and thanks to, one of the projects we funded was an intern to go down and document all the patterns. And they actually made graphs and then made little cards. There are books, but they also made little cards and then plasticized them like you would with a luggage tag or something, and then put them on binder rings so that as the kids learn, they have this resource available to them. That's another thing that's been done over the years, is to document those patterns so that they won't be lost, so that they're there for the future, and helping with the collection at the Center for Traditional Textiles. And I should say that we work with CTTC in Peru. We work with Arte de Campo in Asur in Bolivia. And we're actually looking to expand to Ecuador. But the situation in Ecuador is a little different because the indigenous people there were enslaved by the Spanish for textile production. So community traditions were very much lost. So in Ecuador, there are a few families keeping those traditions alive. And then the one community place that we visited is they weave on, it's a community textile production, but they weave on what they call Spanish looms, which are floor looms. And they're doing non-traditional. There's a little bit of patterning they do in some of their work, but a lot has been lost and would need to be revived.
It's interesting you're talking about collecting the patterns and making them available for younger weavers. That was one of my questions. Is I spoke to Laverne Waddington pretty recently, and she's learning the traditional methods to use herself. But I don't know how many folks outside that community are likely to pick up backstrap weaving. It's not something that is going to find a great audience of active practitioners outside that culture.
Yeah, it's true.
Right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right. Partly because a lot of the people, at least in the US, who weave are older, and it's really hard on your back. And it's hard in the Andes, older people don't weave. They spin because their backs just won't take it anymore. I think the fact is that you can do these things on a regular loom, and you can do them very nicely on a rigid heddle loom. In fact, we ought to ship some rigid heddle looms down for the older people and see if but it's the really elaborate stuff's hard on the eyes too. One of the things we bring gifts to the communities. And one of the things we started bringing down is reading glasses. And it's so funny. You'll see somebody put them on and their eyes just get wide. It's like, what is this? Oh my gosh, I can see, so it's just a little thing, but gosh, it can extend somebody's weaving life a long time. I think it's kind of like when I've taken classes from Laverne, and she is wonderful. And I finished my pieces, but I'm not spending my time at a backstrap loom because my back won't take it either. But I think part of it, like I took an Orenburg lace shawl class years and years ago from Galina Kamaleva, and I'm not knitting Orenburg lace shawls because it takes months and and I can't get the cashgora. But when I bought an Orenburg lace shawl, I sure as heck appreciate and treasure it. And I think that when you take some of these traditional techniques, you may not practice them yourself, but you understand what goes into it and you value it. We always, when we bring tourists down, we always have a day or so of classes. And we actually often have people who say, I want to learn that specifically. And we'll be in a community and we'll just make an arrangement with the community. So-and-so would like, while we're there, to have a class, a private class. And they'll be paired up with usually one of the young weavers and study something specific. So, like, I'm still working on some Nazca edging. Nazca is one of the pre-Incan civilizations in Peru. And there's a special kind of cord that they made. And I definitely need reading glasses to do it, but it's really fun.
When I was at Tinkui in 2017, I took a class on the bobble hats. I think it's from Acta Alta.
Yes.
And I am kind of obsessed with the bobble hats. I love the bobble hats. But of course, the knitting is easy. It's the fact that somebody is sitting there and making the bobble cord.
Right.
It's essentially novelty yarn that somebody is making by hand. And it's just like crocheted, but it's a different sort of, they understand it a different way. And I would do it for a little while and I would hand it to somebody. She just crack up laughing at me and shake her head. Rip it off. Show me once more and hand it back to me. I don't know that I made more than one or two bobbles.
I know.
Very different experience of learning.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Jennifer and I asked for a lesson in Bolivia this year on halka weaving, which halka, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's red on black and they have these fantastic mythical animals and they're just intricate and there's no they just make it up as they go along. And Jennifer and I were trying to figure out what the structure of the cloth is because it's very unusual. And we still don't know. Jennifer's been trying it and we still don't know. But this lady had us pick a couple of rows of the pattern, and they do it so fast you can't even see their fingers move. And I'm doing this, and she's just, in Spanish, she's just telling me, pick this many black, pick this many red, pick this. And I would do a little section, and I'd show it to her very proudly, and she'd kind of smile. She'd pick it up and she'd repick it. And she'd say, okay, do the next one. It's just like, it's a gringa problem. But
and that's an accommodation for how we learn, because that is not how, if you were a young villager, how you would be taught. You would not have someone smile and redo the work for you.
No, probably not. But you wouldn't be learning on a piece that big. I mean, there were probably 1,200 threads in this, but Noelle Bennett, who has written numerous books on Navajo weaving, once told me that the Navajo have no word for to teach. Their word is to show. And I think that is probably true in the Andes too. Actually, Ed Frankmont, who was one of the founders of Andean textile arts and was an anthropologist, he actually taught weaving classes at MIT to give MIT students an appreciation for the fact that they didn't invent technology. There has been technology for, but Ed said that the way kids learn spinning, or at least used to learn spinning in the Andes, is that they've been around it, they've seen it. So at age like between 6 and 8, a girl is given a spindle, a pushka, and sent up to herd the animals and told, don't come back until you figure out how to spin. And Ed said he'd been out hiking and he'd come across a kid just crying because it's not working, which all of us who've learned spinning with a drop spindle have wanted to cry once or twice. But he said, the kids always come home, so they get it eventually. And, yes. And he said, and then he said the mom will be, the women like to smoke cigars. And he said, you'd see a woman playing cards with her friends and smoking a cigar and saying, yeah, taught the kid to spin today. So.
Oh, dear.
Not exactly helicopter parenting.
No, not helicopter parenting. Well, I think it's, however it happens, I am grateful for the opportunity to learn these things that people have been practicing and passing on, whether they're teaching or showing, for a long time.
Well, I'm grateful too. And Anne, I have to say, I would never have ended up working with Andean textile arts or going to Scandinavia if it weren't for interweave and now long thread. You are responsible for helping keep these things alive in a big way. And I hope in your hectic days in publishing, you take time to feel good about that, because you should.
Well, it really is a pleasure and an honor. And, one of the things about the podcast is that every 2 weeks I get to sit down and have a conversation with somebody else who cares as much as I do. So thank you so much for being part of my week, Anita.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking me. It's been fun. What a great way to start the week.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.